Never trust that fucking owl. It's for real, dude. Now it's time for, like, Rosetta Stone or one of those other, like, language companies to come out and be like, we will never use AI, and all of, like, the, you know, the socialists will then use that side. Alright, let's see. We've got a new weekly. Time to get in. Oh, you're already in. Look how quick they are. Alright. I'm gonna put in on some light background music for now. I'll be back in a second. I just need to go get some more ice for my CBD soda. We get some nice background music. Chock-a-block. Hold on. I want to put my ice. Wow. 1616. Oh yeah, that's not. So where were we with Truanon? Let me see. True Anon, the game. Okay, we were halfway through part 3.
Successfully gone through the program.
So we'll play some, we'll listen to some. Wow, we really are min-maxing. I'm gonna be listening to some Truanon while we play some Super Auto Pets. Okay, we're halfway through the game. This podcast series is a mini-series by Truanon. It's called The Game. We are on the 3rd episode, but do not worry, you'll find it interesting even if you are just jumping in right now. It is about the troubled teen industry, an industry that did even affect Brace, one of the Truanon hosts, about how it is unregulated, unlicensed, and in many ways just essentially straight up exposing children to pure torture. There's nothing else good. It's something called, I think, exposure therapy is what they said. Like, something that was disproven ages ago, but is still used in these camps. And they go through how it all started, from something called Synanon to, like, other various off branches from that, and why did it end up becoming this thing that was like used in these camps for troubled teens in quotation marks? Anyway.
I also remember when Akampora committed suicide in 2005 with a gunshot to the head after it was revealed that he had siphoned millions of dollars out of the organization.
Chuck despised these splitters for stealing his model, watering it down, and partnering with governments in order to spread this sanitized version of his program. None of them had the spirit of Synanon in them. They thought addicts could be reformed and returned to society. The defections and copycat programs caused him to
Bad
brood
breaks.
and to figure out ways to prevent it in the future. It's hard to trace the exact methodology of all rehabs back to Synanon. While the first batch might have mostly had ex-Synanon members deciding the curriculum, and certainly some weird shit went down at a lot of these places, the industry eventually outgrew Synanon. The trip, the dissipations, the game. At many places, these fell out of favor and were gradually replaced by a more professionalized approach. Drug rehabilitation in America is now a $42 billion industry.
Oh my God.
The rehab cartels may have evolved past the Synanon model, but the predatory practices and exploitation of patients remain.
Programs for adult drug addicts weren't the only offspring of Synanon. The entirety of what is commonly called the troubled teen industry, or TTI, sprang from it as well. One of Synanon's stated missions was to combat the scourge of juvenile delinquency, and while Synanon's relationship with children was beyond troubling, it was the basis for what is now a billion-dollar industry focused on the supposed rehabilitation of young people. One of the first and most prominent examples was a program called CEDU. That's C-E-D-U. The name itself is somewhat mysterious. While later said to be a vague reference to see, like you do with your eyes, or do, like doing an action, the reality is that CEDU almost certainly stands for Charles E. Diedrich University. And this tracks with the genesis of the organization. The founder, Mel Wasserman, was a square Synanon adherent, if not a full-time member. He closely studied the methodologies of the organization before pouring his furniture store profits into opening up a Synanon copycat program in 1968. It was aimed squarely at so-called juvenile delinquents and staffed by former Synanon members. And so, Synanon's dissipations, trips, games, all of it was transposed onto the unaccredited group homes that Mel Wasserman opened up. The main school was at Running Springs, a teeny town in a remote part of San Bernardino County next to Children's National Forest. In many ways, the early press that CEDU got mirrored Synanon's mainstream exposure. In reality, CEDU developed a culture of violence, child abuse, and repression that mirrored Synanon's own descent. But unlike Synanon, torturing human beings only helped CEDU grow. The school shook off bad press. It became a symbol of hope for worried parents who were told that if their children were not sent to CEDU, then their children would die.
Personally, I find this ironic. 3 children very likely died solely because of CEDU. One, Daniel Yun, ran away in 2004 and was never found. The other 2 vanished in 1993 and 1994. One investigator has raised the possibility that their disappearances might be linked to a serial killer named James Crummell. Crummell was living with a psychiatrist contracted at various teen programs around Southern California at the time. However, others have suggested it's more likely that staffers at the school caused the death of these teens, and then told their parents and the police that they'd run away, vanished, without a trace. CEDU would eventually close down in 2005 because of an impending regulatory crackdown and a huge number of lawsuits related to the practices of the program. But CEDU provided the blueprint for nearly every single behavioral modification school, not just throughout America, but across the globe.
Now, I have my own personal connection to CEDU. Patrick McKenna, the founder and owner of Monarch School, had been sent to CEDU as a child. He loved it so much that he immediately took a job at Rocky Mountain Academy, CEDU's Idaho campus, after graduating. He lifted their program wholesale when he started up the Monarch School, poaching several employees on his way out. The first time I heard the name CEDU was out of Patrick's mouth when I was 14 years old. It was during the game.
For those that don't know what the game is not just like this abstract sort of concept. Okay, even though the word the game sounds abstract in itself, it was the process whereby these exposure therapy in inverted quotation like marks would be where it would go through. So essentially what you do is you'd have these group sessions where you talk to people, and the idea would be that you would literally say the most awful anything you'd ever thought about them. You would say to their face, and you'd try and break them down, and it was like in a very sort of group, like it was group abuse basically, and that's how like these sessions would work. And you were not allowed to like confide in anyone outside of the game, or like outside of, you had to like, the point was you were supposed to be broken down. It was pretty insane. I recommend, if you're interested in this, go back and listen to the other 2 episodes. Yeah. Anyway, pretty insane stuff. Scientology does that as well. Doesn't surprise me.
But we haven't forgotten about Synanon. Synanon's tax problems were growing. The Marin County assessor and the IRS were breathing down the organization's neck. In classic Synanon fashion, Chuck and his massive legal department cooked up an unorthodox solution. Synanon would become a legally recognized religion. Now, to be clear, no one at Synanon truly believed they were actually becoming a religion. The central tenets of the organization didn't change.
In fact, Synanon's dumbass board recorded hours worth of tapes detailing precisely how they were going to fool the IRS by becoming a religion.
Oh my
These
God.
would later be revealed in court. Here's a TrueAnon tip. Never, ever, ever tape record any kind of meeting you ever have unless it's with the police.
But the power that Chuck held over so many people and the absolute command he had over parts of the organization meant that, in essence, Synanon was a religion, worshipping at the altar of Chuck. And he sought to codify this. In even more classic Synanon fashion, this plan didn't fully work out, and Synanon's tax problems would soon grow to enormous proportions. By the mid-1970s, Synanon had around 200 children living at the Tamales property. Kids came to Synanon in a variety of ways. Some were the children of members who were separated from their parents. Others were sent to Synanon by their probation officers to cure them of their juvenile delinquency. The Tamales Bay property had become something like the Synanon city that Chuck had imagined. While the residency still hovered around 500 to 600, plus a growing population of children, they had tried as much as possible to integrate themselves into Marin County power structures. Several residents were volunteer sheriff deputies. They had a fire truck, an ambulance, and yes, their own police force too. But relations with the residents of the sleepy towns near Synanon continued to fray. There were brawls. Synanon members began to beat the living shit out of anyone who they thought had crossed them, or might. Paranoia about splittees ramped up.
And so, a paramilitary force called Her Majesty's Imperial Marines was born. Her Majesty was Betty Diedrich. They were led by a Vietnam vet who bragged about his necklace of ears during the game. A new type of martial arts was developed called Sin No. Their motto was Eternal Vigilance. $300,000 worth of guns were purchased. And still, this wasn't enough. They formed a type of National Guard. Synanon's members, most of whom now wore the same blue overalls that Chuck favored, were attacking anybody near their properties who they deemed unsavory. Neighbors were threatened. People were seriously hurt. Ranks were assigned, armbands were issued, marches were performed. Synanon viewed itself as building something like an army. The madness that had begun to infect Synanon in the middle 1960s had blossomed into full-blown psychosis. While residents maintained that they had some freedom to pursue their own recreational desires within the Synanon system, their lives were in large part controlled by Chuck's flights of fancy. In 1975, all the women shaved their heads.
Oh
now
my
there
goodness.
was real uniformity at Synanon. The problem of the children had gotten worse. Betty and Chuck now viewed them as dead weight in the organization. At first, it was required to ask Betty for permission to have a child. Sometimes she
busy
granted
raccoon.
it, sometimes she didn't. Then, all members were asked to voluntarily forego childbirth. in 1976, members were given an ultimatum. The men at Synanon, all of those above age 18, were to have vasectomies or leave the organization. Women who got pregnant were made to get abortions, including one rumored to have occurred at 9 months. The only children they'd take in were the ones sent by the state. The kids they did have were organized into the punk squads, quasi-military boot camps that sought to instill discipline into children by constant games, denigration, beatings, and military drills. Most of the children hated it. Many fled to nearby farmers' houses, begging to be sent home to their parents. This caused another layer of friction between Synanon and the outside community. And in response to the constant stream of runaways escaping from the punk squads, Synanon members began to threaten and beat their neighbors in Marin.
Membership began to decline. People who had joined Synanon in the hope of bettering themselves lost faith that Chuck was the type of person who could help with that. The situation grew worse once Betty died in 1977. While she had strange ideas and, like Chuck, exercised extreme power over the members of the group, she had somewhat balanced her husband out. At least she'd been able to occasionally critique him. But once she croaked, all bets were off. Chuck put out applications for a new wife. He selected a 31-year-old woman named Ginny Shorin. While devastated by the loss of Betty, this gave Chuck an idea. What if everybody at Synanon got a new partner? And so, the organization institutionalized remarriages, where partners were separated from each other and then reassigned to other members. 230 couples filed for divorce. Once you have a cadre of dedicated people like those at Synanon, people who hadn't been weeded out by the insanity of the past decade, who could look at any crazy old thing and say, if others are for it, then I'm for it too. That's when you have a group that you can lead. Anyone who objected to the Changing Partners program was put in the game and bullied into either taking it or hitting the road. So it was with everything at Synanon. The game was a mechanism of absolute control, and the dissipations, trips, and overall social pressure whittled off the wobblers and made certain that only true conformists would remain, at least until something happened that was beyond the pale even for them. Synanon now had assets upwards of $33 million. It had a giant fleet of boats, planes, and countless vehicles. There were airstrips being built, more properties purchased throughout California, including a fancy new home base in Badger southeast of Fresno. There was talk of opening up an embassy in Washington, D.C. Synanon, sensing their image was fading, opened up a massive charitable wing,
Grace
although it
talks
was
about,
naturally used to make a profit.
Other people
They donated hundreds of pairs of sneakers
in later on, like in his experience.
Despite all of these efforts, things were going off the rails and quickly. Synanon was being hit with constant negative press, and it wasn't just confined to local publications. National news networks ran stories about the strange goings-on up at Tamales Bay. Chuck and company responded with threats of violence upon media executives and their families. Chuck himself insisted on going on TV and making these threats explicit. But remember, Chuck always wanted more. Threats meant nothing without the muscle and willpower to back them up.
Damn.
In 1978, Chuck
Well
Diedrich
done.
would learn that while he may have, at one time, been good at saving lives, he was an absolute failure in his attempts to take them.
Spooky.
Hi, Brace.
Hello, Liz.
So I was thinking, as we've been kind of talking about this, that,
Damn, I'm rolling.
you were kind of, you talked about how your school was basically like there's a direct line from Synanon to your school.
Yeah.
And especially like through the game, right? And that you kind of practice that, or were forced into those fucking therapeutic circles at Monarch. But did you guys ever do any of the other kind of Synanon style stuff, the stuff we've talked about, the trip, the dissipations, those things?
So, yeah, we did.
I think it's pretty safe to say that we did. They weren't called like all this stuff, like the way that the things they call it changes, right? Mm-hmm. Like you might call a game a rap or like whatever, a group like we called it. We didn't have trips or dissipations, but we had something called insights. We had, I think, around 6 of them. I went through 4, 3 or 4, I think, or maybe 3, and like these. I also had these 2 seminars. Maybe I went through one of the seminars, and they were intense. They were more intense than groups or anything like that. Like, before you go through one, you're not allowed to know anything about it. When someone goes through it, you're not allowed to talk to anybody who hasn't been through it about it. You're not allowed to talk to your parents about it. They really, really, really specify, do not talk to your parents about what happens at these. They kind of make it feel like you have this cool secret in you, but really it's covering up abuse. And I remember seeing kids go through them before I went through one, and they had this sort of like otherworldly, like ghostly air about them. They weren't allowed to talk to other students while they were going through them. They didn't come into the dorms until after we were all asleep, and they only slept they left before we were all up. I know you didn't eat much, and they lasted for several days. So my first one I went through, I was really nervous for it. And I was really nervous that like this seems to be where like the real breaking happens, like where a lot of kids like really lose their shit. I remember Patrick McKenna, the owner of the school. He had been to CEDU, which is modeled after Synanon, like we talked about, he was like the big proponent of these. Like he was like they were like his real baby there, and I remember doing this shit like they were really like several days long. I didn't sleep much. I honestly don't have a huge memory of like what exactly occurred in a lot of them. I mean, I do vaguely, but I just like not for the second to second. I just remember like specifically there were like a few things that really stood out, which is one, it's like, I remember you had to like sit and look at somebody, like, you went through these things in peer groups, like the kids, like you basically went through the program with that kind of got there at the same time as you. And you had to like go to, I think it was everybody in your peer group and say every bad thing you've ever thought about them to their face. Everything. And that was not enjoyable, especially for some kids. You had to do like, we'd have like hours and hours and hours and hours worth of group. There was no hiding at all. Like the counselors would find you and they would break you. Like that was the point of this, like explicitly really the point of this, is that they would break you down until you were like a groveling mess. And you weren't sleeping. This was for several days long in this sort of mirrored room. And you weren't really eating. You weren't really allowed to use the bathroom. There wasn't really any water. And it was just like, I remember there was one that was like, integrity is the one I remember the most, because I remember we were like discussing the meaning of the word integrity in that one. And I was like, I don't think the people doing this have that. It was innocence, where there was a lot of like kind of pretending to be a little kid and stuff like that. And it's like, they were showing you like, this is who you killed. Like all of your choices, they made you stand up against a wall at one point. And then you had to like talk about all the choices you've made in your life, every choice that you made in your life. And then say like, this leads me to fear and death. This leads me to fear and death. I remember having to like just say over and over and over again, like everything I do is going to kill me. I am going to die. Like over and over and over.
Sorry, I had
I'm
to
going
leave
to
and do
die.
something quickly.
One point,
I didn't want to
you're on your
interrupt,
fucking
okay.
knees. There's people pushing down on you. You're screaming like, I don't deserve to live. I don't deserve to live. Like over and over and over. And that's really when you start to lose it, right? Like it's like the repetition of this like really deeply traumatic stuff over and over, hour after hour, like day after day. No sleep, no fucking, a little bit of sleep, but like not much, especially for a kid. Like no real food, like just over and over again. And they had this, like this is sort of the most notorious thing. The girls in some of these would like have to act out like rapes that they had happened to them. Like
That's
sometimes with male
insane.
counselors as the rapist, sort of playing that role. you'd have to tell everybody every secret you've ever kept from anybody. Like, it was really like this sort of, felt like you're being gutted the whole time. And I remember leaving every single one I went to. I remember leaving and being like, I feel like, I don't think I'm supposed to feel like this. Like, I feel empty. Like, I feel like a husk. I feel like somebody, like, I've had a lot of people beat the shit out of me in my life. And I felt like that. Like, I felt like I had just, like, been fucking run over by a truck. And these things broke, they broke a lot of kids through these. These were really like, they get you into fucking the pot and they boil you. It's funny, kind of like before I really started seriously thinking about this stuff, I'd always sort of contributed my being relatively okay compared to a lot of people after coming out from not having gone through all the insights. And through, like, every time I went through one of these, just like every time I went through a fucking game, like in my head was just like, die, motherfucker, die, like over and over, like in the back of my head, like, I am not falling for this, and I would lie and I would try my best to, like, not get in this, but they would exhaust you so much that, like, by the end, I remember, like, this happened a lot. I mean, they would do this every so often throughout these, but they make you all lay on the ground. Sometimes you have to, like, cuddle with the adults there and shit like that.
Oh my God.
And they play songs. And the one I remember the most, because it became my most hated song, but also I remember sort of relating to it, was the Talking Heads, Watching the Days Go By.
Once in a Lifetime?
Yes, yeah, Once in a Lifetime. And I remember thinking, like, I was like, this is not my beautiful whatever. And I was like, my God, I would kill to just even have a house or a wife or a car, or something that these people didn't own. I don't even care if I recognize it or whatever. Or like, what, I just, any, that was like this, like, outside world taunting me. And I think it's in those insights that I came the closest to breaking, not just breaking and, like, going along with the program, like, I don't think I was even going to break and go along with the program. I thought I was going to break mentally. Like, I thought I would become psychotic or have, like, a nervous breakdown. And I saw people have what I would call fucking nervous breakdowns in those a lot of times, become, like, wretched at the hands of like Patrick and the people leading these. I remember vividly actually thinking, like, oh, I think this is torture. Like, I think they're torturing us. And I mean, yeah, God, I can't even put myself halfway in the mind of somebody who would do that to kids. But yeah, it was in those insights that
well, the
really,
ground
like,
leaves, you earned me.
The evil, the fangs came out for these programs, right? And that's where they had you locked in that room. You weren't allowed to tell your parents about what you'd seen in there. They could do whatever they wanted to you in these. And that's, like I'm saying, where I saw a lot of kids break and a lot of kids lose their minds.
On the next episode of The Game, The Story of Synanon, Snakebite.
Episode. Part 4, Dissipations.
Straight PSA, take number 1.
Watching a helpless child struggle with a drug problem is tragic. It'll do nothing less than tear your heart out. But there are people who can help. And that's why I'm so pleased to talk to you about Straight. Straight helps families cope with and overcome the problems of drug use. Straight also gives young people the opportunity to reclaim lives nearly lost because of drugs. Organizations like Straight give us added strength in waging the war against drugs. And like most wars, we must win it to protect our children. If you suspect your child has a drug problem, get some help. With programs like Straight, a helping hand is available, but the first move is yours.
1978 was the year everything fell apart. A man in Southern California phoned attorney Paul Morantz to report that his wife had been taken by Synanon. Ed Wynn, that's first name Ed, last name Wynn, said his wife had gone to get some treatment for her depression from a local clinic. They'd recommended Synanon. So she'd went to check it out. Within a day, she was on the road to Tamales Bay, her hair all gone and her husband confused. Ed's wife struggled with mental problems that Synanon couldn't fix through attack therapy in the game. But she remained with them, dipping in and out of psychosis for days while being told she couldn't see her husband, and he was being told that he couldn't contact her. She was terrified, her husband was terrified, and only by the maneuverings of Paul Morantz was she able to be released. Morantz promptly sued Synanon for imprisonment of Mrs. Wynn. Synanon lost and was forced to pony out $300,000. It was a massive blow to the organization. Synanon was suing Time magazine over unfavorable coverage, a lawsuit which so engrossed Chuck that he stepped down from the board in order to devote more time to it. In practice, this meant little. He was still paid a massive consultant salary. He remained living in the plush Synanon facility called Home Base, and his word remained law within the organization. Synanon's legal department swelled with lawyers. They sought to annihilate Synanon's critics in the media by inundating them with lawsuits. The beatings of splittees and opponents increased, too. Although they were never caught, it's very likely that Synanon killed and then hanged the dog of one of the most prominent old-timer splittees right outside his home. More threatening mail was sent out. Teenagers from the punk squad, still fleeing for their lives and sanity, were chased to neighbors' houses by Synanon members who sometimes shot at those ranchers who tried to help the kids.
But they were not without allies, although these allies were often as crazy as Synanon. Cesar Chavez, suffering from many of the same megalomaniacal delusions as Chuck, started integrating Synanon members and the game into the United Farm Workers structure. Using Diedrich's example, he led a reign of terror within his organization, with Dolores Huerta by his side, turning the UFW into something more like a cult than a labor union. Synanon tried to open up an embassy in D.C., ostensibly to promote their charitable arm, and found they could no longer muscle people out and push them around as effectively as they had in the old days. The building they moved into had tenants. When Synanon beat some of those tenants up, they sued Synanon and won. Chuck's unpopularity on Embassy Row freaked him out. He'd been throwing his weight around out west, but D.C. was different. There was also the matter of an ongoing investigation by the local Tamales Bay newspaper, the Point Reyes Light, digging into his finances. So with reporters hot on his heels, Chuck split for Europe with $2 million, landing in Italy. He stayed there with all his family members, all of them working high-paid positions at Synanon, and some close friends. To cap it all off, Chuck started drinking in Italy. His daughter, Jadie, a Synanon executive, became an expert beer drinker. Synanon's second unbreakable rule had now been broken, once again by the man at the very top. 6 months later, the crew returned to the U.S. The Synanon they returned to was unrecognizable from even 5 or 10 years before. It had fully transitioned into a self-help commune dedicated to business success mindset. Some Synanon employees now earned a salary, although many still got little more than a meager allowance.
On October 9th, 1978, Paul Morantz found himself in a hurry. A former member of Synanon had been beaten badly a few weeks before and was still in the hospital. Paul had purchased a shotgun, had made statements to the press warning Synanon off. He was paranoid about car bombs or shots through the window. But today he was mostly concerned with the start of the World Series, the Dodgers versus the Yankees at Dodger Stadium. Paul lived in L.A., and as he rushed into his house to grab something, he noticed a strange shape in his mailbox. Listen, if you ever see something shaped like a snake, assume it's a snake. Doubly so if you're on the hit list of a violent cult known for taking extraordinary measures against its critics. Paul realized his mistake as the rattlesnake extended itself and sunk its teeth into his wrist. He didn't hear anything. Synanon had taken out the snake's rattles. The only sound was the screaming coming from Paul. While the medics loaded Morantz into the ambulance, one of the attendants asked him, "Where was the snake?" Paul said it was in his mailbox, and that Synanon had placed it there. Paul was in the hospital for 9 days. The press, previously wary of Synanon after the group's successful lawsuit against the San Francisco Examiner, finally began to investigate the cult. Exposés were run on Synanon's hit list, on their threats to reporters and splittees, and the countless beatings the organization inflicted on critics and anyone who they deemed a threat. Paul Morantz held press conferences from his hospital bed, pointing his finger at Synanon. It was an arresting image, a salacious story, and Synanon was finally in the crosshairs.
I don't even know what to really say anymore about just how intense this entire thing is. The fact that it still exists, and the fact that like this sort of level of exposure therapy was disproven, and yet they still do it. Insane.
Paul's neighbor had seen two young men with shaved heads put something into his mailbox and had taken down their license plate number. Police tracked the vehicle to Synanon. Chuck handed over two members of the Imperial Marines. One of them had been a former punk squad member and was the son of prominent big band leader Stan Kenton. The police raided Synanon's facilities and carted away boxes of tapes, memos, and tranches of documents. The thing is, Synanon recorded everything.
Oh, wow, droll.
All the games, groups, sessions, all of it was taped and broadcast over the wire to the community and stored to be replayed in the future. Now here's a TrueAnon tip.
Yeah.
Do not record yourself telling the community that you reign over, that you want a specific guy's ear in a jar, as Chuck did in reference to Paul Morantz. You don't want to say that someday critics of Synanon will get, quote, killed dead, physically dead, as Chuck did. You don't want to mention the guy you're going to kill repeatedly by name alongside all of this. Chuck was arrested in a trailer at a property Synanon owned in Lake Havasu, Arizona.
Let's go.
He was, according to the assistant DA for Los Angeles, so drunk he couldn't stand, surrounded by empty bottles of Chivas Regal. He had to be carried out. He was booked on conspiracy to commit murder. To this day, nobody really knows if Chuck himself directly ordered the Imperial Marines to put a rattlesnake in Paul Morantz's mailbox. Those who might know won't say. The madness that Chuck had within him spread outwards, with the members of his group.
Okay, dude, that's a ridiculous way to put a hit on someone. What are you doing, dude? By putting a rattlesnake in their mailbox? I would do that. Do not say that. Real despot.
Absorbing and reflecting it back out at the world. Chuck may not have ordered that hit, but Synanon did. And Chuck was Synanon, just as Synanon was Chuck.
His lawyers claimed he wasn't healthy enough to stand trial, a classic Weinstein-type defense, due to his obesity and drinking problem. It seemed that the man wasn't taking his own medicine. He was eventually let off with 5 years probation, a fine, and an agreement that he would no longer take part in Synanon or play the game. The lawsuits piled up, and Synanon, for the first time in well over a decade, began to lose
okay, one more game,
profitability.
and then I'm gonna head off everyone.
Members left, even some of the kookier square types who came in at the beginning of the decade. What's worse is they were giving interviews to newspapers describing Synanon's culture of paranoia and violence. The rattlesnake attack led to renewed interest in Synanon from the IRS. Remember, Synanon was, on paper, a tax-exempt charitable organization dedicated to the rehabilitation of drug addicts and alcoholics. The numerous recordings of this purported charity engaging in the planning and discussion of violent acts was not helpful in maintaining this image. The IRS audited the organization in 1979, revoked their tax-exempt status in 1982, and spent the next decade or so chipping away at the organization over their destruction of records, obstruction of investigations, and perjury. Dozens would be indicted over Synanon's cooked books. The violence had a measurable cost as well. Synanon spent millions in payouts to those they'd beaten, kidnapped, shaved, and snaked. The rancher who helped funnel Punk Squad children to safety was awarded a huge sum. Synanon lost their case with Time magazine. The Point Reyes Light, the teeny Tamales Bay paper, which had won a Pulitzer for its reporting on Synanon, was given a large settlement. And so Synanon continued to shrink, selling properties, hemorrhaging businesses, losing members. Diedrich ensconced himself at the Badger home base, drinking and losing his mind. He still played the game, only now he did it through his young wife calling in from a telephone. He gave television interviews while visibly drunk.
By the early 1980s, it had become normal to drink at Synanon. They even held parties where getting loaded was the explicit purpose. Synanon's mission was hazy. It was a loose collection of people with nowhere to go, still desperate for Chuck's wisdom as he sunk deeper into what would later be assessed as bipolar episodes. Members weren't living communally anymore. Salaries were paid out and non-Synanon employees brought in to cook and clean. It took another decade for Synanon to truly go under.
5 spaces
But
left.
it did go under. Reduced to living in rented trailer homes outside of Fresno, the final members went their own way in 1993. Chuck Diedrich died of heart and lung failure in 1997. He was 83 years old. His death was greeted with numerous obituaries,
Oh my
describing
god.
a beautiful start, a tangled middle, and a savage fall. They recounted the early success, the defiance, then the hubris, the puffed chest, and the violence. They spoke of the failures of a man to meet his own vision, the failures to be responsible to the addicts under his care, and the failures of Synanon when it came to children.
No one else for SAP? Get in. Last game.
Here's the thing, though. Synanon's story doesn't end in 1978 or 1982 or 1993. It doesn't end with the death of Chuck Diedrich in a double-wide trailer. Synanon lives today under different names, under different men, in facilities all throughout America. The Synanon model, notorious for its failures when it came to children, became the way to straighten out troubled youth. The violent cult run by an unstable man, tarnished in the eyes of everyone from Time magazine to the FBI, has been directly, if unofficially, franchised all throughout the United States and beyond. True to Chuck's vision, it is a billion-dollar industry. The behavioral modification industry, the troubled teen industry, juvenile delinquent programs, whatever you want to call them, almost every single one of the thousands that exist has lifted its program from Synanon. Many originally sprang from Synanon staffers or members who left, bringing the program with them. The acid dreams of Chuck Diedrich did not die with him. They are inflicted in the game, with fists, with isolation and work details, on tens of thousands of children every year. Picture this. You are 16 years old. You're a bit of a troublemaker. Maybe your grades aren't so hot. Maybe you smoke some cigarettes. You might have even gotten in some fights or been expelled from school. You could have even had sex a few times. Your parents are worried, and they reach out to your school counselor for help. They're handed a business card for an educational consultant.
Educational consultants are people paid to,
2
quote
spots left.
unquote, assist students and families with educational decisions. They are usually referred to parents by counselors, administrators, sometimes even courts. Their job is to
think my
recommend
dad
changes
went to
to
one of
kids'
these programs.
programs
Oh my
or
God,
curriculum and come up with new school strategies to help kids who are struggling. About 25 to 40% of placement referrals into behavioral modification programs come from educational consultants. But they don't do it for free. Like an affiliate marketing program, educational consultants get paid referral bonuses for placing kids in specific programs. Similarly, prospective parents are often given contact information for families as references. A lot of times, these parents are also paid, usually through discounts on the expensive tuition,
And now
to
I
give
think
glowing
he went to one
reviews
of
and
these.
reassurance
Oh my
that
God.
everything will be okay. Absolutely none of this is regulated.
All right, we're gonna
and
start.
no company, consultant, or third party is under any obligation whatsoever to disclose any financial relationship at any point.
Now, you're asleep in your bed, 4 o'clock in the morning, when a couple of men barge in and wake your ass up. You don't know what the hell is going on. Your mom's
All right, we
there in the
started.
background, giving you a weak smile and some pathetic reassurances, while the men grab you by the arms and put you in a car. Maybe they tell you where you're going, and maybe they don't. If you run, they'll chase you. But the point is, you don't run. They're here to terrify you. These men are escorts. The escort industry exists to transport children from their homes to facilities within the troubled teen industry or behavioral modification umbrella. It's a silent part of a massive network, the subject of very few investigations compared to schools or wilderness programs. One of the most prominent escort companies was Bill Lane and Associates. Bill Lane was a hardcore early Synanon devotee who left in the 1970s to develop the program at Sea-Doo. The escort industry, which transports children across state lines against their will, is an integral part of this process. It is also, for many children, the most traumatic experience of their lives.
So the escort puts you in the back of the car, or maybe sits next to you on an airplane, and takes you where he's ordered. For the majority of kids, that's a wilderness program. This is the type of program that parents are often referred to by the educational consultant. They're marketed as boot camps, the kind of tough love, short-term interventions that will help wayward kids get back on track. Wilderness programs are intended as something like a system shock for children, to jolt them out of their past reality into their new one. Hard work, sweat, fear, insane orders from unaccountable adults. It's a grim industry.
So before I was sent to Monarch, the escorts actually took me to a wilderness program. The one I went to, Sagewalk, was in the Oregon desert. 2 months of trudging up and down the same dirt road, collecting firewood,
Ziggy.
and having diarrhea
Exactly.
while a guy named Cougar yelled at me. 3 years after I left, the program was shut down for the death of a child named Sergei Blackenstein.
A lot of people may be
Fuck.
familiar with the name Outward Bound, or maybe the drill sergeants yelling in the faces of out-of-control teens on Sally Jesse Raphael. These programs got heavy promotion from daytime talk shows in the 80s and 90s. The schools are often in remote areas, such as the Utah or Oregon wilderness, often employing very young college students in charge of what are purportedly unstable children. The kids will often face hunger, injury, lack of medical care, or treatment for mental illness. And for most kids, these camps are just the first stop. As you may have guessed, wilderness programs are often paid what the industry literally calls bounties, referral bonuses to long-term boarding facilities. Many employ what they call advisors, basically salespeople, to call parents and stoke their fears about their child's future. Usually, it goes something like this.
I'm sorry, I know this is tough to hear, but we've seen this before. You need to get your child in as soon as possible. If you don't, they will end up in jail or a mental hospital, or just dead in the gutter. You have to come to terms with the fact that you've lost control as a parent and you need help as much as your kid does. Look, this is what we do. We can take your application right now. We can expedite the process, but we need to get your child in a controlled environment where we can impose discipline. And we need to do it quickly, before it's too late and they are lost for good. You know they are in danger. You know you have nothing left to give them. Let us take it from here.
Insane. Insane. The manipulation.
When did you start trusting your dad again?
Well, that's a good question. I really tried to, like, when I got back, I was like so thankful that I wasn't going to jail and that he wasn't sending me back, that like, I really just kind of didn't bring it up again.
Really?
I was just like, I'm going to do my own thing. Like, and at that point, like, funnily enough, for the rest of my teenage years, I had a pretty, I kind of just did whatever I wanted.
Because you
most of
guys
the
are
time.
pretty close now.
Yeah, we're really close now.
But I
Yeah.
imagine, like, I don't know, like, as we've been going through all of this, a thing that's been hard for me is, like, trying to put myself in that, like, mindset of parents that I don't know. I mean, that process of acceptance or understanding or whatever to move past with him, like, I imagine that.
Yeah.
Would be
Yeah.
really tough.
For me, like a lot of the times when something like that
I mean,
happens,
the thing
like,
is,
I just try to forget about it and pretend
one of the biggest misconceptions that like people have about these camps, I feel like, is like just that the parents don't care. Now, like the thing is, it's like, yeah, to an extent you get parents that are a little bit more aloof, less interested in their children. But these parents get manipulated by these programs. Like they are the targets at this point. Like it's not about your fucking child's consent. It literally is about manipulation of them. That's what all the marketing preys on. And that's why they kept on saying, like, yeah. I don't know.
didn't happen. You know what I mean? Rather than dealing with it. And that's really what I did for a lot of my childhood. And then I moved out and I was like, well, I'm like, my dad and I weren't really close in a lot of ways. And I was like, I moved out when I was 17, just a couple years after I got back. And I'm like, I'm just going to do my own thing, And, I didn't have, I saw him and stuff, but it wasn't like a lot of communication. It was really like when I turned, it was just when I got older and like I was really in a lot of trouble with drugs. I owed a lot of people, some of whom were kind of dangerous people, a lot of money. And I had so I burned all my connections. I burned everyone I could rip off. I burned a lot down. My dad helped me get into detox. He really helped me, which took a few times, but he really helped me out a lot when I really, really, really needed help. And when I had, he should not have, or not he should not have, I'm really glad he did, but when a lot of people would have been like, no, don't talk to me. And I was banned from the house for a long time, but after that, but it was, yeah, I think, I'm older now, and I get being a parent's hard. I wasn't really that bad of a kid, but there's been a lot of stuff.
I'm just getting owned. Left, right, and center, just owned.
A lot of issues with her.
Never mind.
And I think my dad was just scared, and I think that it's like we described. My dad talked to an educational consultant, and they were like, "This will help your fucking dumbass kid." Because I got really bad grades. This will help your dumbass kid, be more disciplined. And my probation officer was harping on it. And it was just I think my dad was just scared, and they really preyed on that fear. And one thing they would do at Monarch, and this is something that I will never, ever, ever fucking forgive these people for, is they would make you repeat over and over and over again, and it would make your parents repeat it too. This was the mantra, or mantra, whatever. It's if you weren't here, you would be dead. And so their whole belief system at Monarch
That's
revolved
insane.
around the fact that you had to convince yourself, and your parents had to be convinced that if not for this minuscule this little
34 MKD 50, thank you for the 50 tier 1 gifties. Holy moly, thank you 34 MKD 50.
miracle that happened to you, this twist of fate that you ended up at this place in Montana, you would be in a fucking graveyard. And it's looking back, it is ridiculous to, I no, that's not true, for almost any kid there. But it's something, you tell a parent, you look a fucking mother in the eyes who's scared about her 15-year-old daughter or something, and you're I know, I've worked with kids for 20 years. Your little daughter would be dead right now if she wasn't here. And you say that enough, they're going to believe you. You know what I mean? No one wants to take that. Parents don't want to take that chance that oh, my kid could be dead. Well, maybe it's not true, but it's you have to act like it is. And so they do. It's really insidious with a lot of these schools. They exist to keep kids in beds and to keep the place full. And so they'll do whatever they have to do to get to that point. And the thing is, that drives you crazy too, because I would repeat that over and over and over, and I'd have these I was in the back of my head, I'm I don't know, man. I smoked weed 3 times. I get drunk off half a Bud Light. I don't think that I would be dead right now. But every day you're repeating this stuff, and it's It does a fucking number on your psyche, too.
I was gonna say, what does that do to you?
I mean, I have...
You start internalizing it?
Well, it's funny because, like, it's weird. Like, sometimes it's like I have these flashes. Like, I'm 14 years old, like, digging this stump out on, like, day 10 of work punishment in the winter, like, trying to bust through the permafrost in fucking Montana with a shovel. And then I'm, like, later on a teenager, and it's like... I just have these flashes of just like where I am, like, like taking the bus or like, and then later I got into drugs and then the war stuff. And like, it just like, I kind of like look back and I'm like, I know these things are all connected somehow. I don't really know what the thread that connects them is, but like, I do know one thing that I felt during every single one of those periods is this like tremendous sense of guilt. And guilt, I know from like, I left Monarch. And I left all those other people behind, right? And, like, I don't think they would think of it that way. But, like, I left, and, like, all those other kids had to stay there. Even among, like, a lot of kids I was friends with when I was younger, like, a lot of those people are dead now, because of ODs and suicide, all that kind of stuff. It's like, I left a lot of that behind. I was a drug addict. Like, a lot of those people are dead. And, like, I got out of it, fighting war, all that stuff, like most of those people are dead. Like not a lot, but like the majority of those people are dead. I'm not. And it's like I have this like compounding guilt from all of that. And it's not just guilt from like me being able, like being lucky or whatever, or like whatever the reason is for getting out of these things, but it's also like I have this other guilt, like guilt over women is a major thing for me. I think know, like, and I know a lot of that stems from fucking this fucked up shit that we were taught at Monarch, like on how to, like, I don't even know how to describe it, but it's something that I grapple with a lot. This like guilt over not, not being able to, if someone's asked me to do it, if I can't to do something, if I can't do it, I feel insane about it. And all of that, like I can really trace back, like all of that had its genesis at Monarch. And from all that fucking funky shit that they made us do, I mean, all of these things that have like
there we go.
really, really just like sunk their claws into my life and just like gotten deeper and deeper and deeper. And I'm aware of them and I do a lot to get past them, but like that shit's there. Like it's like, it's like a splinter, it's like I can't get out. And I yeah. And so all of that I can just trace back to Monarch. And it's all stayed with me. So what started as a 6-week boot camp quickly turns into an 8-month, then a 12-month, then an 18-month, and soon a 3-year placement boarding school. The true length of the typical stay isn't advertised for a reason. It's much easier to persuade a parent to send their kid away for a couple weeks than to suggest that what their child needs is to be separated from their family and their friends for several years. So, an escort picks you up from the wilderness. You know what's coming. Some amount of time spent in a school which you really only know from rumor and vague reputation. Maybe you're going to a Sea-Doo-style facility, a work farm with intensive therapy ripped straight from Synanon. Maybe you're going to a lockdown like Provo Canyon, where you're in for years of standing in a fugue state in between shots of Haldol in your ass.
Yeah, my milkshake brings
or maybe
all
you're
the
being
boys
put
to
on
the
a
yard,
plane
but
to the
it turns out
Bahamas.
boys are
Smells
bad.
sick.
Does subbing to
To
you
a place with a
5 months.
friendly
on the
name
fast track to
where you will be
UK
starved,
citizenship?
beaten, and
Kappa.
locked in a box. The history of behavioral modification facilities for children in the modern era is a sordid one. Even proponents of the industry should be appalled by the sheer volume of reports involving sadistic abuse of children, systemic violations of their rights, and mental trauma inflicted. Most of these programs last from 1.5 years to 2.5 years, but many of them are intended for the children to stay until they turn 18. As with Synanon's punk squad and juvenile facilities, some children are remanded to these programs by courts or psychiatric professionals.
Almost every single one of these programs took a direct line from Synanon. One of the earliest descendants of Synanon, called the Seed, was based in Florida. The Seed was founded by a failed comedian named Arthur Barker to
Rose
help
Wolfhard, thank you for
troubled
the follow.
teens and experiment with the types of behavioral modification he witnessed
No,
in
this
his
is not the
visits
latest
to
True
Synanon's
Nom.
facility.
We are currently watching actually don't want to listen to the latest True Non. I don't want to hear about how fucked up the UK is at the moment. It's just like depressing. It is very depressing to see a country that had such a strong like workers union be completely obliterated. Anyway, what I wanted to say was no, this is called The Game, and we're on part 4. Anyway.
In New York City. He was able to secure a sizable grant from the now defunct Law Enforcement Assistant Administration, the LEAA. Its goal was to determine whether the attack therapy methods used at Synanon would help reduce childhood drug use and could be used to combat delinquency. What he created was a psychedelic nightmare that drove thousands of children nearly insane. Unlike in Synanon, where the game was punctuated with daily routines, work, socialization, even dances. At the Seed, there was the game and nothing else. Renamed Raps, these game sessions took place every day, from 10 in the morning to 10 at night, for up to a month. Children were made to stand before their peers and castigated, ridiculed, mocked. Many of them had never done drugs. They simply had a, quote, druggy attitude. False confessions became the rule. The more you confessed to, the quicker you could advance through the program and leave. Some children went mad. In an echo of Philip K. Dick's Valis, one got up from his chair, ran full speed at plate glass windows, and burst through to the ground below. The Seed eventually lost its federal grant money, having never produced any of the research that it had promised. A 1974 congressional report titled Individual Rights and Federal Role in Behavior Modification directly compared the Seed's methods to the brainwashing techniques allegedly used on POWs during the Korean War.
Fuck off,
but the larger
dude.
issue is why a man with absolutely no pedigree was given tens of thousands of dollars by the federal government to experiment on unwilling teenagers. Congress forbade the LEAA from funding any similar research in the future. The Seed was forced to give up working with kids and shifted its focus onto adults before shriveling up and dying a couple decades later.
But if you'll forgive an unavoidable turn of phrase, what was planted at the Seed blossomed into something that came to be known as Straight Incorporated. It is exactly as sinister as it sounds. In 1976, a wealthy Florida businessman and Republican Party bigwig named Mel Sembler opened up a program staffed almost entirely by former Seed employees. He received funding from the exact same federal agency that Congress had just forbidden from funding research on teenagers and opened the frontiers to even more brutal methods of torturing children. Straight Inc. is notorious now for its brutal beatings, torture involving feces, public humiliation, and rape of students. Nevertheless, the program was hailed as a success. The Synanon program had been refined for teenagers, and like Synanon, violence was seen as a perfectly acceptable response to any perceived delinquency on the part of minors. Sembler was hugely integrated into the Florida Republican Party, something that allowed Straight Inc. to continue its abuses unmolested by the bureaucracy or any kind of welfare checks on the children. Later, of course...
Let me guess. As I said before, like, this is all just lobbying, and Republican, like, motherfucking senators and House members make sure that legislation cannot be drawn up against these sort of industries because they get funded by them. Oh my god, America is so incredibly fucked. This is absolutely disgusting. What the fuck, dude? This is demon, bro, it's straight demon money.
It was revealed that pressure from Sembler and his friends in politics prevented any
American
kind of
government does not
intervention
give a
into
fuck
what was
about its
happening at
citizens.
Straight. This sort of political pressure on regulators continues to this day throughout the troubled teen industry. Straight Inc. saw visits from Princess Diana and Ronald Reagan, and the Bush family were huge backers of both Sembler and his program. Even after the organization was exposed for its massive abuses, after paying out tens of millions in damages, Sembler's star continued to rise. Just after Straight's closure, Sembler was appointed ambassador to Australia and later Italy. Another prominent member of Straight's board was appointed ambassador to Spain. Straight Incorporated is now known as Drug Free America, an NGO that works with the UN as consultants.
Provo Canyon is, bar none, the most notorious facility for teenagers in the United States. It's well known now after the recent documentary on Paris Hilton, which featured Provo Canyon as well as a Sea-Doo facility.
Provo really is a nightmare. I've spoken to multiple people who attended the program. One said she saw the outdoors only 3 times in 2 years. Students are injected with what they call booty juice, which is really Haldol, an anti-schizophrenia medication that dulls the senses and puts students into catatonic states.
Synanon influenced Provo, too. The school, like almost every other similar facility, subjected children to its own version of the game. And Provo, in turn, influenced 2 of its prominent staffers to start their own network of facilities. The Worldwide Association of Specialty Programs and Schools, aka WASP. WASP was an international network of black sites where children were tortured, raped, and sometimes killed. Kids were subjected to bizarre mixtures of Synanon therapies and seminars borrowed from LifeSpring, a self-help cult. It's hard to fully track the organization. An overlapping network of shell companies and corporate fronts masked the true scope of the network, but it had facilities everywhere from the Czech Republic to Jamaica, and of course in Utah. In the troubled teen industry, if a facility gets shut down, it might reopen the next day in the same building, with the same staff, the same children, the same program, just under a different name. For example, a WASP facility called Dundee Ranch in Puerto Rico was shut down by child welfare authorities before reopening under the name Pillars of Hope. A program called Kids of Greater Salt Lake was closed and reopened on the same day as Lifeline Incorporated. Cross Creek Academy was shut down before reopening as Youth Foundation Success Academy. Sometimes it's not just the facilities getting new names, it's the owners. Steve Cardasano, often called the godfather of wilderness therapy, is one of the more notorious examples. After the preventable death of a girl at his Challenger Wilderness program in Utah, and the deaths of 2 other children at programs run by his former employees, he was barred from working with children in the state. His next venture, a wilderness program in Hawaii, saw him banned from working there as well. So he went abroad, changing his name, opening programs in Samoa, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands, and leaving a trail of abuse and trauma in his wake. None of this was secret. To the owners of these programs, a tough love guy like Cardasano was an asset.
WASP programs were stricter than strict. Children were told to look at the ground when moving, or not to speak unless spoken to, were starved and restrained when they were perceived to be acting out by staff. And the staff were, almost to a man, totally unqualified, uncredentialed, and often criminals forbidden from working with children by the U.S. government. What? The troubled teen industry has a similar view on credentials as Synanon did. That is, credentials were an unnecessary roadblock required by ignorant regulators and only served to get in the way. It was a free-for-all environment where adults could do whatever they pleased with children. At almost every behavioral modification facility, communication is monitored. Children are not allowed to speak with their parents outside of the presence of a staff member who stands ready to hang up the call if the child should start detailing their abuse.
Oh my
Letters
God.
both to and from parents are read by staff. Parents, too, are told that their children are manipulative liars who are just trying to come home. WASP even had a program, designed by a longtime LifeSpring employee, that manipulated parents into cutting off contact with their children if they chose to leave the program after they turned 18. It's hard to stomach reading much about WASP, but so much of the program sounds familiar to me. There's attack therapy, modeled off of the game. The seminars they held were straight out of Synanon, reenactments of childhood trauma, public confessions of minor infractions, girls made to wear signs that said things like shameful slut. But the trauma only compounds at these programs. The trauma of being picked up and whisked away by strangers in the middle of the night, the trauma of isolation, punishment, the trauma of bearing your sins and inventing new ones in front of people who are forced by the program to betray you. It's an industry that is constantly at the frontier of creating new psychological tortures to inflict on children who have no recourse, no appeal, no lawyer, no way to seek help. These methods are used over and over in behavioral modification programs for teens, overseen by unlicensed adults with no training who are making millions of dollars.
And they do make millions of dollars. WASP alone made hundreds of millions in revenue each year. WASP owner Robert Litchfield and his brothers raked in a lot of additional revenue by owning not just schools, but also companies that were in charge of billing parents, educational services, construction services, even emergency social services. It's not just WASP. Almost every school is like this to some degree. Many of them even have their own escort
Well done,
agencies to take
AEC.
kids to and from the facilities.
Okay. We'll continue with this tomorrow. Oh wait, it's not over. Never mind.
WASP owned and operated schools in
Built your
multiple
money.
countries before most of them were shut down owing to deaths, rapes, and countless reports of child abuse. There are survivors groups and a website with resources for those who attended the program. WASP as such no longer exists, though its programs continue under different names, with the owners of WASP receiving money through payment processing, transportation, and other services. Robert Litchfield continues to get rich.
If the schools themselves close, the program might be brought by staff elsewhere. CEDU, like we mentioned in the last episode, came straight from Synanon via Mel Wasserman and Bill Lane. When CEDU was shut down, a former staffer, Patrick McKenna, opened his own school, obscuring links to the disgraced program he had just left. He brought with him Timothy Earle, the son of a former CEDU school director, and Steve Rookie, who was rumored to be married to Mel Wasserman's daughter. They called their school Monarch. Monarch functioned like so many of these other schools, by convincing parents their children would die without the program, and then traumatizing as many children as they could under the guise of helping them. That's where I went. To be clear, everything said about WASP and CEDU schools applies to the entire industry. It's estimated that around 50,000 American teenagers go through these programs every year. This is an industry that operates with virtual impunity.
I think it's important to note that WASP, Provo, the original wilderness programs, so many of these came from Utah, and many of them have close links to Utah politicians, especially Mitt Romney. WASP owner Litchfield was the finance director of Romney's 2008 presidential campaign.
I contributed too, in my own way. The wilderness program I attended, SageWalk, was owned by Aspen Education Group, a subsidiary of CRC Health, itself a subsidiary of Bain Capital. Mitt Romney had been the CEO of Bain, and he still receives a sizable payout from the company. Aspen Education
course,
Group,
Mitt Romney.
like WASP, owned a huge number of facilities, but most of them are closed now. Many are closed because teenagers died under their care.
There's a reason these programs are in out-of-the-way places. Oftentimes, behavioral modification facilities will be the biggest industry in a town, or even an entire county. CEDU alone employed hundreds in Bonner County, giving them well-paying jobs in what was termed the educational field. On the Montana-Idaho border, where the Monarch School was located, there's a cluster of schools with hundreds of children. Some of the towns around the schools have fewer than 200 people living in them. The schools provide a huge economic boon to the area. There have been attempts at the federal level to regulate behavioral modification programs and the troubled teen industry, but almost all have died on the vine, facing stiff opposition from GOP lawmakers with ties to the industry. Congressman George Miller introduced the Stop Child Abuse in Residential Programs for Teens Act in 2007, which would allow federal regulation of wilderness programs, boot camps, therapeutic boarding schools, and behavior modification programs aimed at adolescents,
Let's
and would
see.
prohibit many of the more egregious acts of punishment these programs employed. They'd also mandate
Well, then,
inspection
ADC.
every 2 years. Congress rejected it over and over, most recently in 2017. The bill was precipitated by the famous, and I believe only, report by the Government Accountability Office, or GAO. Other bills.
Wow. I wonder who's lobbying to make sure that that legislation doesn't go through. Okay, everyone, I'm going to send you to Peganox. I'm gonna go chat with my mom. And yeah. I'll see all of you tomorrow. We're gonna be doing Fear and Bingo. Okay, Fear and Bingo. Right. Yeah. I am gonna be probably very tired tomorrow. I would have been up very early. But I'll see you all in my best spirits possible. And all of that. Much love to all of you. Okay?